Hey folks, welcome to The Flow, where professionals from the world's fastest growing companies come to share their best practices and tips in the workflow. So I'm your host, Tyler Koblasa, and today we have on Alex Priest, former Chief of Staff and Marketing at Uber. So it's been quite a ride at the journey at
yeah, it has.
a ride-hailing company, right? And love to hear a little bit about your background. And you spent some time in DC, worked with some senators, and what was kind of the journey like that as far as in marketing communications that led you to working with Uber?
Sure, yeah. So I went to school in DC, went to American University. Like most liberal arts majors, started out undecided, and took an intro to business class early on my freshman year, and decided, oh, okay, this is interesting. I could get into this. Quickly decided that finance was not my side of the world, the business world that I was interested in, and sort of wound up on the marketing side. And then over the course of 4 years, gradually added on a communications degree and a statistics minor. So kind of ended up with a really interesting hodgepodge of stuff. But throughout the process, interned at nonprofits, foundations, and interned on Capitol Hill with Senator Harry Reid when he was still the majority leader. Wow. And really just had a great number of experiences while I was in college. One of the ways I've described it historically is, I got a lot of really great experiences in college, but a lot of them were really telling me what I didn't want to do rather than what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And then my senior year, really started to sort of network in the DC world. The DC tech scene is burgeoning, but small. Mm-hmm. And got to know some of the people in the startup world out there, the marketing world out there. And at the time, of course, social media was the big hot thing. Yeah. So sort of became well networked in that world, ended up a startup right out of college. But
wow.
Yeah.
And then spending time at Capitol Hill and in DC, as that startup ecosystem was evolving, were there kind of mixes of kind of government and tech, and what was that, just kind of those early days, what were those days like?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, the sort of Venn diagram of industries in DC is really interesting, where government obviously is sort of the vast majority of things in DC, mm-hmm. government and contracting. But there's a huge number of nonprofits in DC, and then the tech scene sort of is kind of overlaid across all of those things. So when people, are in tech in DC, well, at that time, of course, 2011, Living Social was still really big. They owned half of downtown. They were the big DC tech success story, which is totally out of left field. But below that, you had a lot of tech startups who were thinking about event planning, thinking about how nonprofits could be more efficient, thinking about how governments could work more effectively. There were a bunch in the energy sector. There were a bunch in the sort of I don't know, just sort of advertising sector, It was an interesting world at the time. The startup that I started out of college was a advertising firm. So they were thinking about how you could create mostly video ads, video commercials, videos with a relatively low production cost.
Okay.
So they worked through this sort of curated crowdsourcing model. And it was interesting. The execution was not the strongest, which is why I ultimately moved on. But it was an interesting model, and you're just sort of one of any number of small companies, really just sort of thinking outside the box from the typical DC company.
Mm-hmm. How large a company was that when you started?
It was 6 people.
6 people, yeah.
It was really
you guys did anyone have a dog? Because you sometimes get to have a startup dog.
No one had a dog.
No dogs.
I think that was probably their big downfall.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. That was the problem.
Yeah. And then was that at that stage company, were you kind of focused mainly on the owned, the earned, the paid, or how did you guys think about marketing, getting the word out about the?
They were very B2B, and I was 22 and fresh out of college, so I didn't really know what the hell I was doing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, my focus with them was on sort of building a brand via social media, thinking about how we optimized inbound marketing. So building landing pages, mm-hmm. thinking about, actually we started to think about podcasts and sort of widespread sort of conference calls, call-in seminars, stuff like that, towards the end of my time with them. But it was really okay, how do we get some of the startups in DC, some of the larger companies to think about, the company's named Genius Rocket, mm-hmm. Think about them as a resource for creating videos or creating advertisements, as opposed to going to a much larger agency. But I don't know how they're doing nowadays.
Right on. And then what was from there? What led you? What were the kind of next steps in your career path? And
So from there, it was kind of dumb luck. I met a guy at a event in, it was probably September, October of 2011. And he was a friend of Rachel Holt, who ultimately became the first general manager for Uber in DC. And he called me up in October, November, and was like, hey, we're looking for somebody relatively well-connected, fairly tech-savvy, to fill this community manager role for Uber in DC. And I had heard about Uber. I'd seen Travis speak at a conference that summer. And I was like, oh, it sounds kind of interesting. Like, I wonder what happens in DC. And of course, Uber is still super small.
Yeah.
And I told Sean, the guy who called me, I was like, you know what? Like, I certainly have some people who could be interesting, but actually I'm interested. So here's my resume. Like, let me know what they think. And I ended up talking to Rachel on the phone for about an hour, meeting her and Ryan Graves for cocktails. And before I knew it, I was starting at Uber.
From when you guys had those initial conversations to when you actually started, what was the...
It was probably a week.
A week? It's like, all right, let's do it.
It was really fast paced. Yeah. I mean, Uber at that point had, 30, 35 employees probably. So there was no HR. There was one recruiter.
Yep.
There was no super formal process. They had a creative exercise where, you had to write some like blog posts and come up with some ideas and some like draft support responses. And I did that. And then we talked about it a little bit over cocktails at this like networking party and went to dinner afterwards. And then I started, I think it was like 5 days later. I didn't even actually I like tried to put in 2 weeks notice at my job. And ultimately it was just like, this makes more sense to just go on and like get out of it and get started. So I started, the Monday after the soft launch of Uber in DC. So I think it was like November 18th or 19th was the soft launch, and I started on the 22nd. It was the Monday before Thanksgiving in 2011.
But, amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and at that point, the other cities that were live?
It was San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Chicago, and Boston.
Okay.
So DC was our 6th city.
And then how much longer then LA launched? What was it like in?
LA was 4 or 5 months later. It was like March of 2012.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I'm just kind of coming from LA and thinking about the journey of the company.
Yeah, it was very, very shortly after. Because I remember actually Austin Geit, who was our head of launch, who was later on one of my bosses and a really good friend, was launching LA, and we had just done DC. So it was me and her were like really, really in touch during the LA launch, because they were like, oh, how did things go in DC? How did you do your launch party? How did your blog post? How did you do your email? And I was like, oh, well, we did this, and helped him get it all up off the ground. But
amazing.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's great.
So early those days with regards to kind of community, like what did that entail? And I mean, because it sounds like there was many different.
It was broad. Yeah, it was super broad. It was super broad. So the original sort of nuclear structure of the city team within Uber was a general manager who sort of ran the show, ran the P&L. And then you had a community manager and a driver operations manager. Yep. And it was roughly divided, economically. So you had sort of the rider side of the business, demand, and the driver side of the business, supply. So on the community side, it was the rider side of the business, but you were really thinking about demand across the board. So it was everything from PR and partnerships and promos to putting together events to thinking about ultimately thinking about regulatory conflicts. Yep. But it was also all support. So if people left a bad rating on a trip, you were supposed to follow up. If people couldn't get a ride, you followed up. It was email marketing. It was social media.
Wow.
It was design. We didn't really have any designers. So like if you look back at some of the earliest emails from like 2011, 2012, it's stuff that like we all hacked together in like PowerPoint and Photoshop. You know, that's like not particularly good and certainly not on brand, but at the time it was the best we could do.
Amazing. So that really kind of gave you the opportunity to kind of leverage some stuff you learned before and just really just you could kind of work on all the different aspects of kind of driver. This is on the rider demand and just all aspects of kind of communicating with that market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was the best playground to learn in you could possibly ask for, because it was a culture, it still is, where you really kind of learn as you go and you're encouraged to take risks and try new things and just sort of get your hands dirty. And at that point, there were no resources to lean on. So, if you needed to find a segment of writers to email, then you learned SQL and you figured out how to like code the script, pull it out of the database yourself, and code the query. You learn so much so quickly that way whenever you kind of have to. And I think that's one of the best parts about being early at a startup.
So from the company before and then into Uber, what were kind of some of the things you learned around as far as like your personal process and like ways that you kind of thought about, productivity and also just specifically like, how you would, because the opportunity, there's obviously infinite things to do, as we always know in startups.
Of course.
But how did you kind of prioritize and think about, your own personal processes?
Yeah, it's evolved a lot over the years, even just in the last year. But I think, my first startup out of college I was actually kind of bored in a lot of ways. It was B2B. They didn't have a budget. There wasn't a lot of momentum. And ultimately I found myself sort of struggling to figure out how I was going to fill my day.
Yep.
At Uber, you have the opposite problem, right? Where it was like, okay, there's like infinite number of things to be done. Yep. Especially, I started and my first 3 weeks were basically figure out how we're going to launch this, figure out how to get invites out, throw a party, and get the business off the ground. And it was like, oh, okay, cool. Yep. Let's go. And then of course, 2 weeks in, we changed the logo, all the branding. That was when we switched from the big red U to the little sort of black, purplish, weird badge.
Yep.
And we had we raised our Series B. And then we started to sort of get like rumblings of regulatory things. So it was a very interesting time. Productivity wise, I think back then it was really just sort of go.
Yep.
And I think to some extent when you're early on at a startup, you just do things that don't scale and that's just how it goes. It was sort of gradually learning to appreciate spreadsheets, learning to appreciate, different pieces of software that could help sort of make your day ever so slightly more efficient. One of the things that I was really proud of in the early days of Uber was introducing Text Expander to the community manager group at Uber. It was something that I'd been using for a little while, sort of off and on. It didn't have a perfect utility for until I got into writing support responses. And when all of a sudden you're doing, I think in my time at Uber, I did 50 or 60,000 support emails.
Wow.
But when you're doing that many emails, when you're doing literally hundreds a week or even sometimes hundreds a day, you find yourself saying the same thing over and over and over. And something like Text Expander, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you type a snippet and it sort of expands it. Becomes really, really, really valuable in terms of just saving, seconds, but then turns into minutes, turns into hours. And every little tool I could find like that would save a little bit of time or make it easier for us to collaborate across community managers was really, really valuable in the early days.
Amazing. And kind of as you guys kind of built the playbooks, like what did you because you were kind of juggling all the different tasks up front on the side. Now, with like kind of the next hires and your team, your department, how did you guys kind of really kind of evolve the processes and just overall, because ultimately it leads to efficiency, but kind of evolving the processes, what was that journey like?
My roles at Uber actually shifted in a lot of ways to reflect sort of how we figured that out as we went along. So, my first year at Uber was sort of every city for themselves. Like you're just figuring it out. Nobody really knows what to do. There's not really a real playbook. There was a launch playbook, but there wasn't much beyond that. And then second year, we started to build teams within each city. So we had, we were managing groups of people. We had multiple people managing support. We started to think about how we standardized some processes and some support answers and some marketing things. And then my third year at Uber, I actually moved out to San Francisco. Okay. And I took on a role that was almost exclusively about standardizing and building process around marketing for Uber. So I joined a team called the Pro Team, which stood for Process, Resources, and Optimization.
Okay.
Which was really all about taking those things that we'd done on a city level and those things that we'd learned over the previous, 2 or 3 years and saying, okay, how do we make sure that every city from here on out isn't reinventing the wheel on those things? And how do we make sure that when you launch a city, you have all the guidance you need right out of the gate to just sort of open up a box and say, okay, go. And when we do these large scale campaigns like on-demand ice cream or on-demand kittens, how do we make sure that those are standardized and those feel consistent across cities? And how do we make sure that branding starts to feel consistent and that communications are relatively on point, not totally off the wall, and creating some playbooks for crisis stuff and making sure we avoid, disasters, which we did a mixed job of. But it was really all about that. And that whole team was really structured with that goal in mind, to sort of bring these very autonomous, very independent cities together in some way.
So tools you kind of recommend for kind of standardizing processes as a company is growing, was this a combination of things like a wiki or Google Docs, or what were your
kind of... a broad combination of things. It was everything from, we used Asana in the really early days. Eventually we outgrew it. We switched to Confluence by Atlassian eventually for our sort of intranet, and that was where we started to build all of our internal playbooks and guides and stuff like that. But a lot of it was just Google Docs, emails. I became well known at Uber for writing incredibly detailed, super long emails with like all kinds of color coding and action items and stuff like that. Because ultimately, there were 2 or 3 of us at HQ, and if you had to launch like on-demand ice cream, for example,
Yeah.
our second or third year we did it. You were basically corralling this group of, 50 to 100 community managers across, 40 to 50 cities. And you were trying to get them all to send an email that was relatively similar without doing it for them
Right.
across every city all at the same time, without, destroying your deliverability and without like totally destroying your brand.
It's ice cream. Who doesn't want ice cream?
So that just level of coordination was really, really tricky. And a lot of it was really just like writing these like super detailed emails. Like literally if you printed them out, they'd be like 3 or 4 pages, but it was like, you'd have your like TLDR at the top with like, do this thing and this thing and this thing. And then like you'd have like spreadsheets where people had to like sign off on things and check that they'd done it. And there were like little approval processes that we built in, but it was always it was a healthy tension between letting them be autonomous and add that sort of local flavor and local personality to things, while at the same time making sure that things weren't totally rogue.
Right. So there was literally a ice cream day kind of playbook and a kind of checklist when you're going to run them.
Yeah.
How did that ice cream, the campaign like come about? It was someone just kind of tossed the idea out, or because it was a genius. Everyone's like, oh, the ice cream trucks, you open the app and who didn't want ice cream, right? So
It's a great question. There are conflicting stories. I think, the Boston team and the DC team both kind of take credit for the idea. In my memory,
yeah.
it was Rachel Holt and I were sort of spitballing ideas for what to do over July 4th in DC, because it's super hot. There's a ton of people in the mall. We were like, okay, it's really hot outside. There's a zillion people out for the fireworks. How do we create something that like gets people's attention around Uber? And our first idea was like, oh, maybe we'll do like, on-demand bottled water or on-demand popsicles or something like that on the mall. And then it was like, oh, wow, this is really hard because, well, A, you have terrible cell service. There are no roads on the mall.
Yep.
At that point, we only had like professional limo drivers, and they weren't about to like, get out of their car and run waters to people.
No.
So we were like, hey, how do we do something fun that's like kind of in that same vein? And I think it was probably a combination of our brainstorm and the Boston team thinking along the same lines, where ultimately we were like, oh, well, like what's one thing that everybody loves that would be really cool to like be able to push a button and get. And ultimately we came down to ice cream. And there's a zillion ice cream trucks in DC and Boston and most every city. And we partnered with just all these sort of independent little ice cream trucks, and got them on the system. We gave everybody an iPhone. We had like a brand ambassador in every ice cream truck. My fiance now actually was one of our original like brand ambassadors in an ice cream truck, and sent them out on National Ice Cream Day. And that was our first year. We did it in, I think, 7 cities, and it was like super low key, but it exploded way more than we expected.
So the playbook literally was like you would go to identify all these independent ice cream trucks to then kind of onboard them, or was there actually a data, like an existing database of ice cream trucks you can? No, I was going to say,
you're kind of figuring it out as you go along. I think some cities, like I think in DC, we may have actually found a company that owned a bunch of ice cream trucks, and we worked with them. So they had like 10 or 15 ice cream trucks, and we just kind of had them do it. But different cities did different things. Like New York, I think the first year had several independent sort of ice cream trucks that they did. The first year was really all over the place. It was, some people worked with like companies, some people worked with like super independent people, and it was very much just trial and error. What we learned that year, at least, was that like, it's super high in demand. Like people really, really, really want ice cream. That we would never, ever fulfill that demand with any amount of supply of ice cream trucks. And that pricing and quality were big factors to like play with in terms of levers for manipulating demand and manipulating supply. And then if you look at the sort of the history of on-demand ice cream, the way we did it each year is actually dramatically different. It may have felt the same as a customer, but the way we actually managed building, getting the supply out there and managing pricing and managing demand to make sure that it wasn't just a super futile, annoying experience, was a lot of trial and error throughout the years.
So you really applied some of these logistical playbooks to on-demand ice cream.
Yeah.
Wow. Has any company ever done that ever in the history, you think? I know. It's amazing. So again, you were there from around, you said around 30 employees or so when you joined? And
yeah, probably 30, 35 by the time
And you spent about, was it 6 years or?
It was, I hit it would have been my 6-year anniversary, Uberversary, last November. I was on sabbatical at the time, but so I lasted a little over 6 years. But.
Amazing. And then, so some of the challenges from like actually like the kind of growth, going from startup mode, a couple cities to just as you guys took off, again, one of the fastest growing companies in history. What were some of the things kind of you learned if you were a part of a a high growth company, again, just some of the challenges, and then how you guys kind of collectively, obviously on the process team, like explicitly, that was what were some of the challenges, and how did you kind of learn from that as far as you'd apply it to scaling?
There's a lot. I mean, one of the things that Uber, in a large part succeeded for was the sort of autonomous nature of these city teams, right? But I think, looking back, especially from a marketing perspective, I think there's a lot of value in bringing those teams together early on and starting to think about how you streamline some of those things. Things like email marketing or social media, for example, are things that consume a lot of resources very quickly, but don't have to, right? Like if you're Uber early days, I mean, really for the first 3-4 years, every city had their own Twitter account, which is like kind of cool from like, okay, your city has their own
personal
brand and stuff like that. But you need a person behind each of those Twitter accounts.
Right.
And for each of those Twitter accounts, you also have a certain amount of inbound that you get from a support perspective. And then you also have a certain amount of content that you need to create to make that handle interesting and worth following, which means that ultimately you're creating kind of like 2 or 3 jobs out of each Twitter handle that you create without any real benefit to the brand. Ultimately, like does Uber as a brand really benefit from having, Uber Tucson as a Twitter handle, right? Like, questionable. And ultimately, does Uber really benefit from having, 100 people who aren't email marketers by trade trying to do email marketing on top of support, on top of social media, on top of partnerships, on top of promos, in every city around the country? Or do you benefit by sort of scaling those things in earlier on? And I think ultimately we were a little late to scale those things from a marketing standpoint anyway. But there's a million things that we probably could have scaled sooner. But at the same time, you also can't discount the success that we had with those independent teams and being able to move quickly and stay nimble and stuff like that.
Because really you were able to launch ultimately hundreds of cities around the world.
Yeah.
And then be able to also kind of give that ownership to each department and each team to also connect with that local audience, which could have different cultural norms.
Totally.
No, it's
especially internationally.
Yeah. Awesome. So as far as kind of like your kind of some of the things on that journey, and as far as kind of like productivity, like practices, tips that like you personally kind of live your week or your day that you've kind of brought into, your personal workflow, any kind of specific things that come to mind and that you kind of live and breathe?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think sort of philosophically, there's a few things that probably really, really speak to me now, especially after having taken I've taken the last year off sort of as like a little breather from Uber and from life, and got engaged and moved and all that fun stuff. But I think, as I move into sort of the next phase of my career, I think one is really sort of giving yourself space, right? It's very easy to stack your day with meetings and to go from half-hour meeting to half-hour meeting or 25-minute meeting to 25-minute meeting. I think if you don't give yourself some space around those things whenever you can, or at least at the beginning and the end of your day, you end up at the end of your day and you're like, what the hell did I do today? Right. Yeah. And then you end up spending your evening or your next morning or your next day processing what you did the previous day instead of really kind of being able to handle it on the fly. And for me, I like to be able to take, 5 or 10 minutes after a meeting or after a series of meetings to at least sort of process, like figure out, okay, what did I write down? What do I need to do next? What do I need to tell my team to do next? Creating that space in your day to sort of process and make action out of things, I think is really important, especially when you're in a leadership role. I think the second thing for me is, just sort of having an outlet, right?
Yeah.
Like, I found at Uber that burnout it's like a super real thing. Yeah. And especially in the startup world. Yeah. And I didn't really realize it until I was probably in my 3rd year. I didn't take a vacation until I'd been at Uber for almost 3.5 years. Wow. And, in the last couple of years, I've really discovered that like cycling for me is my outlet. And like, if I don't get on a bike at least once every other day or so, like I start to get a little crazy. Yep. It's like when you have too much coffee in a day, like that's how I just become, like I sort of get jittery and anxious unless I have that sort of outlet. And whether it's yoga or video games or biking or running or whatever, like just having something where you can sort of get out of the zone and like put your phone down and like just focus on something else for a little while is like really, really refreshing to like keep your mind fresh.
Yeah.
And then third thing, what was my third thing? I think finding those little efficiencies. I mean, kind of like I said, I still do that all the time, whether it's Text Expander or having, one of my go-to apps on my phone is Drafts. And it's just like you're sitting there having a conversation with somebody, you're having coffee or whatever, and they mention a restaurant or they mention a bar or they mention a networking group or whatever. And like, always like, okay, where's my pen? Where's my paper? Like, how do I write this down? You're like, sending yourself an email, whatever. Drafts has kind of become my like go-to for that, where you just open it up and it just gives you a blank sheet and you just write down whatever and then it's just sort of in a list and you can kind of go through and process it later. But having those little things throughout your day where you can sort of just make yourself ever so slightly more efficient, whether it's text expander or drafts or, I use things for my to-do list. Kind of all those little like tactical things I think ultimately add up for me in terms of making my day more productive.
Awesome.
And I'm actually, the last year, I've expanded on those things a lot. So I'm excited to do that in the workplace again.
So you were traveling for a bit over the last year and also really the past month or so. So where in your sabbatical world did your journey take you?
Yeah. So I've done a couple international trips. My fiance and I did South Africa last November, which was amazing. My first ever like safari, which up until that point was like, oh, this would be cool to do someday. And now that I've done it, like everybody needs to do it right now. We did Barcelona in April. And then this last month we've been on kind of a post-engagement roadshow. So we did New York, DC, Philly, New Orleans, Orlando, Kentucky, and Denver, all in the course of like 2 weeks.
Wow.
Which is pretty aggressive. But.
So when you're traveling and you're spending time overseas, what kind of, did you have any things that you kind of discovered or you had like kind of realizations after like kind of giving yourself the opportunity to breathe from the kind of the day-to-day with Uber, or what were the kind of, on that kind of personal journey?
I mean, I think the two things that come to mind are running. Like I've never been a runner, but when I'm on the road, like it's hard to travel with a bike, so running becomes what I go to. And running in new cities, especially internationally, is actually really fun. You get to see a lot, and you really get to sort of learn a city very quickly that way. In Barcelona, my fiance and I did we basically left in the morning at like 10 a.m. And throughout the course of the day, we just kind of ran everywhere. So we ended up running like 10 miles that day, but over the course of like 6 hours. It wasn't like, like a half marathon sprint. But we saw so much stuff, and, we were stopping and exploring and doing some hiking and doing some wandering around. And we had like a great lunch, and it's a really fun way to like feel refreshed and like feel healthy, but also get to see a lot really quickly. And then the second thing that comes to mind, which I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm the only one that still uses it, but Foursquare and Swarm are kind of my go-tos when it comes to traveling. Foursquare, of course, is just phenomenal for like recommending places, and like even internationally, I find that it's like amazingly useful in terms of pointing out like the best lunch places or the best bars or the best restaurants to go to. And then Swarm I use as kind of my like life logger. My fiance keeps a spreadsheet of every day, so she kind of knows what she did each day. We're both just, kind of type A. We like to know what happened on what day. But I use Swarm for that same thing. I check in everywhere I go, and it's just super useful to like look back and be like, oh yeah, I was here and here on such a date. And oh yeah, like this was an amazing restaurant, or this was an amazing coffee shop, and be able to have that as recommendations for other friends or for my next trip. So
yeah, no, I've actually a early kind of Foursquare user, and then also Swarm just for that specific reason. You end up with some group at some restaurant, like definitely want to come back here again. And yeah, one
Absolutely.
tab. It's not about like anything to do with social sharing, more just like a life log.
Yeah, it still gets bucketed under social media, but for me, it's like, it's not about the social aspect at all. It's more about like, I want to remember this place, or I want to be able to recommend this place later down the road or something like that.
Awesome. And then, so it sounds like you're going to be kind of onto something new sometime soon.
Yes.
And so it's super exciting.
Super exciting.
Any kind of things that you're going to kind of bring into, like, that kind of come to mind around as far as like workflows, productivity? You already mentioned quite a few of these kind of practices. But anything kind of specific that you think will play into the new kind of strategies and what you do next? Or?
It's a great question. I'm not totally sure. I'm a little anxious, to be honest. I mean, after a year not having like a regular daily work routine, I'm like, oh man, how am I going to manage this? Because it's amazing how you fill your days without a job.
Right.
But I think a big part of it for me is going to be like, really, now that I really recognize the value of like having some balance in my life and having that sort of daily exercise and that daily time with my fiance, like being able to like find that line, I think is going to be much easier for me than it used to be. Which I think is really, really, really important. Some of the people at the startup I'll be going to, I've spent a lot of time talking to about balance and about how they balance their lives and how the co-founders think about balance within the company. And it's really, really healthy. It's just like a really nice combination of like work hard, play hard, but also like, you go home at a reasonable time and maybe you check your email later and maybe you check some emails on the weekend, but it's not, one of my first bosses ever used to say we're not saving babies, and like ultimately that's kind of what it comes down to. Like, you're not saving babies,
No,
like
not on
you're not
call.
on
This is,
call, like it's gonna be fine. Like everything's
Yeah.
gonna be fine.
Yep.
And ultimately, you know, what you often find is that you're far more valuable with a fresh mind or a fresh face than you are, you know, having worked for the last 24 hours.
Yeah. And even coming back to that concept you mentioned earlier around if you've got a, you know, block meeting, will you commonly actually block out like, you know, half an hour just for kind of like meeting follow-ups after?
All the time.
So you have that on the calendar. It doesn't get scheduled.
All the time. Yeah. I try to build in blocks whenever I can. I build in long lunches just so I can like read and like sort of process things.
Yep.
I mean, one of the things going into this new role, it's in a totally new industry. It's in the healthcare space. So I just bought like 12 books on like the healthcare industry, including like a couple like textbooks, like super dense.
Wow.
And I think my first few weeks, like honestly, I'm probably going to block off like 2 or 3 hours in my day just to read because like it's just such a new space for me that I really want to make sure that I understand the space and the industry and sort of what's happening there and what's new. But I also want to understand the operations behind the business. So a lot of it's just going to be sort of learning and absorbing really, really early on and finding that balance between sort of creation and information absorption, I think is really important. So it's going to be interesting kind of getting back into the swing of things.
Awesome. Any recent books that you've read that you are a big fan of that you'd recommend?
Yeah, several. One book that I started at the beginning of the year, which has been super valuable as I've been thinking about the next steps in my career, was Pivot. It's by Jenny Blake. And it's really geared towards people who want to like radically pivot jobs. But for me, even though I'm not moving into a dramatically new role necessarily, it was super useful in terms of just clarifying what my like personal values are and what's important to me and how I should think about my search. And then sort of on a totally different sort of world of things, I finished Dreamland recently, which is all about the opioid epidemic, which is fascinating. And then I've also read a decent amount of fiction. I like to keep a balance of like fiction and nonfiction in my library if I can, but
Yeah, no, it sounds like obviously as far as in the healthcare space, I mean, this is obviously as far as topics and industries, I mean, one that definitely needs some kind of radical changes to take place, especially with American healthcare. So it's exciting you're going to be working in that space.
Yeah, I'm really, really, really excited about it. I think it's going to be neat to make a different kind of impact.
Yeah. And it's based here in San Francisco or?
Here in San Francisco, right down the street, actually.
Right on. Awesome. Well, definitely look forward to seeing you in the neighborhood.
Absolutely.
And last question, what's your favorite ride when you cycle? Like, do you go north, south? It's
a great question. My fiance asked me this literally 2 days ago. My favorite ride is, which I think is probably one of the best rides you can find in the world, is go across Golden Gate Bridge, through Sausalito, up Mount Tam, all the way to the East Peak, and then back down over the Seven Sisters, which is sort of like a series of hills, down to Alpine Lake, Alpine Dam, and then back around and through Fairfax. And you hit all of the things you could possibly want: coastal views, mountains, small towns, cute coffee shops. You name it.
Amazing.
And it's like a 60-mile ride. It's a good ride. And it's a good effort.
All right. Well, I'll have to do some practicing before. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, let's get them for a ride one day. It'd be awesome.
Yeah. Right on. Well, thank you very much for joining us on The Flow.
My pleasure.
And Alex, it's been great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Former chief of staff at Uber on the marketing team and on something new in the healthcare space. So we're excited to see what's coming next.
Thanks so much.
Thank you again.
Thanks.
That's awesome. Good to see you.